She gave herself to him in the smoke-soft hours when the party's laughter had been swept into the velvet folds of the night, and the rain smelled like an apology. The city lights blurred through the wet glass of her town car, pooling down the avenue like coins sliding off a table. She let them fall. Evelyn Marlowe had learned to accept her own absence at every gathering. The applause that arrived as reflex, the small, practiced astonishment of people who assumed that because she moved in the brightest rooms, light must live inside her. It did not. Inside Evelyn there was an echoing, a linen-sweet hollowness she did not bother to fill unless someone else brought a story she could inhabit for an hour. He arrived as if conjured by that hollow. A man in a coat that smelled faintly of horses and rain, standing under her portico with his hair plastered to his forehead, and a look as ordinary and as devastating as a well-placed question. He said nothing of how he'd found the party. He had the sort of hands that seemed used to opening doors and closing cases without staining either, and a smile practiced to the degree of danger. There was an attentiveness about him, not the leering attention of the usual men in her orbit, nor the flattering gaze of those who wanted only to be seen near her. He watched her as if he were learning the outline of her face to read later. She noticed the small things first, the way his voice slid lower over the consonants, like water moving over stones. The faint metallic aftersmell when he kissed the inside of her wrist, as if someone else's memory wrote on his skin. Later, when memory would arrange itself like cut glass, those little fragments would be the threads by which she could not quite pull the man apart. For that first night, they formed a net she walked into willingly. The salon had been stripped of the guests in a slow, considerate exodus. Someone left the piano open, a chord still trembling in the air. Evelyn offered him a cigarette that was more prop than habit. His hands took it without the tremor of a novice. He declined the drink she ordered in a manner that felt like refusal and confession at once. They sat near the window, where rain struck the glass in a steady, impartial percussion. And he listened like a person whose appetite had never outgrown small courtesies. It was intoxicating, the way he seemed to listen. The kind of listening that makes a person forget that they were lonely. When they stood, it was at once inevitable and abrupt. They crossed the threshold into the rooms upstairs as if following a private script. She thought then, foolishly and entirely honestly, that this was how it would be, a private unraveling in which she, for once, would be found. He did not flatter her with promises. He held her with a single hand at the small of her back, and when he kissed her it tasted of honey and rain and something sharp beneath. The iron tang of rain on an old shutter. She thought that hardness was merely the city's salt, or her own hunger given a mouth. In the morning, there was a tiny precise impression on her collarbone. 2 points, close together, like the punctuation of a sentence. At first, she called them a skin blemish, an insect's bite. She smoothed at them with the back of her fingers and imagined they would fade. They did not. They stayed, pale and deliberate, as if someone had scored the skin with a coin. If this sounds like the beginning of a cliché, Evelyn was guilty of many things, but not of unawareness. She knew the histories people told themselves about longing and reckoning. She stood in front of her dressing mirror and watched the points darken. She tried to catalog her feelings, surprise, a hot bloom of vanity that someone could leave a trace upon her, and then an odd defensive anger at herself for wanting him so badly. She dressed for the day in armor of ivory and pearls, the costume she had learned in her mother's living room. Outside, the rain scrubbed the city clean, as if to make amends for whatever it could not repair. If you like slow-burn supernatural tales, subscribe for more. The social calendar did its essential work of distraction. A luncheon with editors, a charity gala where men in tails and women in silk pretended not to notice the way the chandeliers had been rewired to lower their lights every hour. He returned to her in pieces. An unexpected message left with a valet, a note like a pressed petal slipped under the cream of her bathroom tray, a silent shadow at the edge of an event that made the rest of the rooms seem, for a moment, colorless. He arrived always in ways that rendered explanation unnecessary. She invited him inside more often, as if a house could be warmed by presence alone. He seemed to like the corners where light pooled, the library where dust slept on heavy books, the conservatory where a single jasmine vine clung like an old friend. He liked the small hospitality of being asked to wait while she finished, the private school of their minutes together. They shared supper like people who have decided, by small mutual assent, to be dangerous. He ate like someone who savored texture, a bite for the honey of it, a pause on the iron aftertaste, as if tasting the world to see what it would become. In the quiet of their intimacy, Evelyn learned to notice his hands again. The way his fingertips left a map on her skin. The soft hollows of his wrists, where veins sometimes flickered like a rumor. He moved with a lithe restraint that had the feel of something trained. Several times she thought she glimpsed a scale in the pale of his elbow. Absurd. A trick of reflection. Once, when he slept, she traced the line of his jaw as if she could learn the shape of the man by rote. He woke with a small laugh and the taste of jasmine at the back of his throat. She had friends who would later ask if she had been bewitched, who would make the mistake of calling him a siren or a mischief. They did not see the precise cruelty of him, if cruelty he was. They saw instead the way she'd begun to glow, not with light, but with a fevered obligation to keep him close. In those first weeks she felt alive the way a house feels alive when someone moves its furniture. Familiar things rearranged so that the rooms no longer fit the old script. Past cruelty, when it rises in a life, appears like a stain, not always visible, but always suspected. For Evelyn, the stain was older than the man she brought into her rooms. It had happened one summer at a hunting party out of town, years before her name had become an invitation. They had been idle, exuberant, and young in the way rich people sometimes confuse with immortality. The country lane had smelled of cut hay and gasoline. Someone had found a creature curled in the ditch, a long, glossy thing that looked like a folded ribbon of night. The men had jeered, raised voices passing like small torches. Someone had thrown a stone. Someone had kicked. The animal, a guardian, if one was honest with the language of things that lived too close to the edges of people, had been frightened, and then hurt, and finally killed. They had laughed afterward, shaken out their coats, and told the story in the voice of people who invent myth from irresponsibility. Evelyn remembered the noise of footsteps in the grass, and the feeling in her chest that had not been fear, but the twisted rush of belonging. They had made a small pile of rocks around the body like a child's altar and left. The memory folded itself into a sliding scale of guilt and denial. She had not been the first to throw a stone, not the last to step away. But the ledger, invisible to them then, might have started there. In private she thought of that ditch, and sometimes felt that the world had kept a ledger regardless of their laughter. The shard came 3 mornings after he left without explanation. She found it like a truth slipped into bed. A thin sliver of something iridescent hidden in the hem of her sheet, catching the light like a secret glint of sea. It was neither glass nor known stone. It fitted her palm like a promise and made the small hairs along her forearm stand up. When she lifted it to the window, the shard breathed a spectrum across her face, a tiny, liquid moon. It hummed marginally when she carried it, not loud enough for anyone else to hear, but loud enough to make her heart beat a bit differently. She told herself all the plausible stories for why it had been there. A remnant from a gift, a piece of a broken ornament, the echo of someone else's habit. That night she slept with it beneath the pillow like contraband. In dreams it was the color of her childhood, of small, bright things hidden under floorboards. She dreamed of hands. His hands? The hands from the country lane? And of scales and ledger pages turning themselves in a wind she could not feel. Then the first of her intimates did not wake. Claudia Rhodes, who had been a star in magazines and small, clever parties, took a nap in the latter part of a luncheon, and simply calmly did not open her eyes. They found her slumped in a chaise by the conservatory, a fallen glass beaded with green tea still dripping on the rug. Her skin was the white of kept things, smooth as if the sun had focused on every freckle, and then decided they were unnecessary. There were 2 tiny dots at the base of her neck, twin and deliberate, as if someone had made a punctuation mark on living flesh. Funerals do a strange work. They turn a life into a shape that can be lifted and moved. In the chapel the air held the smell of lilies and a kind of hush that was less about respect than management. Evelyn stood at the periphery like someone watching a play where she knew the words but not the right gestures. She watched people fold themselves into sympathy, and absent-mindedly catalogued who would wear mourning as pageantry, and who would let the grief be a private possession. The hand of a man from another social round found hers for 1 beat. She let it be because it performed the role pressed upon them. Later that night, in the small and private hospitality of her bedroom, she pressed her fingers to the points on her collarbone. They were darker now, as if someone had sharpened them with a pencil. She felt the shard in her nightgown like a hot ember. She thought of the country lane and the way small cruelties return but altered and expectant, and she imagined her friends in a pattern she could not yet see. Her guilt, which had been a soft, manageable thing, folded itself into dread. She tried to speak of it to someone who might offer a decent map. Reverend Martin had been an old friend of her mother's, a small man with a good tie, and the ability to listen in the way of those trained to wait for confession. He did not perform miracles, and Evelyn liked that. His consolations were human-sized. Words that fitted into hands. He told her, in his private study where books smelled of orange peel and binding glue, that hospitality can be dangerous. Letting strangers into the house is not always an act of charity, he said, and he meant both literal and figurative doors. He would not suggest curses or exorcisms. He only advised caution, a watch over the small things, the manner of locking doors you might otherwise leave open. Evelyn left the study dissatisfied. The Reverend's words were good for an underlined passage in a magazine, but did not cut into the place where the ledger might be kept. She walked the city streets in late hours, watching other people's windows and telling herself she did not need to be seen. At the corner where the old gum tree leaned over the pavement like the back of an antique chair, she thought she saw movement, a dark figure under the low branches that made the street lamp shiver. The leaves took the light and returned it broken. Something in that shadow felt like a presence that had no need of pretense. That night more things shifted. Her acquaintances began to sleep in ways that alarmed their loved ones. A model collapsed after a magazine shoot. A driver found slumped at a kitchen table with hands still folded over a newspaper. Small deaths at first. The sort that salvage their own dignity by being gentle, like a hands-off from life rather than a theft. Each one, when Evelyn learned to look, bore the twin punctuation. The small double pinprick, located different places, but always twin. The shard vibrated under her pillow when she passed a hospital or a wake, as if it recognized certain deputations. She tried to lay the pattern against the memory of the creature they had killed out of brashness and laughter. But cause and effect is a crude tool in the hands of remorse. The ledger the story spoke of did not look like law books. It looked like a patient thing that kept records in the slow language of returning debts. It did not demand restitution in money or token. It asked for balance in the currency of the living. But balance of what? Of hurt? Of hospitality denied? Of lives set adrift? When she confronted the man, asked him in a voice that tried to be casual and therefore fell into a brittle tremor, he only watched her, his eyes like the dark of a river where something moves under the surface. He listened as she spoke, and then tilted his head, as if a detail had shifted and become significant. "I do not make the world count what it counts," he said once in a voice that was gentle and oddly weary. He never said he would or would not be responsible. He never said nothing at all. He hovered in that imprecision like a moth around a lamp. After Claudia's funeral, Evelyn invited him to her house for supper, not out of a desire for him, but from a new, merciless curiosity. They ate in the dining room, the candles trimmed low so faces could be read like open palms. He asked few questions, he observed, and that observation felt less like affection and more like cataloging. Toward the end of the meal he reached for her hand and pressed. It was a small, secular benediction. The warmth of his touch left her with the twin dots of memory and the shard in her pocket, a tool she could not decide whether to keep or bury. 2 days after Claudia, there was a note waiting under Evelyn's door. It was a single line in an unfamiliar handwriting. Balance, written like a ledger entry, and nothing else. She carried it to the mirror and held it up beside her face, as if the paper could reflect more than ink. She could not tell whether someone was mocking her or warning her. The shard hum under her dressing table like a sleeping animal. People began to whisper. Whispers live in the geometry of the city, in elevators and behind curtains and at the edges of parties. They make an economy of rumor where everyone can be both creditor and debtor. Evelyn felt them as a net tightening and sometimes imagined, with a strange clarity that surprised her, that she had been making payments in silence for years. She saw her life in arrears, favors called in without a ledger, kindness given with strings under the cuff, a careless cruelty on a summer lane that would not leave their hands. One evening she found herself at the edge of the old property outside town, where the gum trees made a small grove like a cathedral for birds. She had expected to meet nobody. She had expected to fetch air and walk until some moral calculation had settled. Instead, she heard a sound that resembled speech without words, a rustle like pages turning in another language. In the clear space among the trunks, there was a woman seated on a fallen log, small and stern, her hair the color of iron filings. She wore a coat that had belonged to a different era. Her face was like a ledger kept for time, lines that had the authority of old arithmetic. The woman did not rise when Evelyn approached. She had the look of someone who had watched many sums drawn and balanced, and had long since adopted the patience necessary to that work. Her eyes were not unkind. They were precise. "You do not yet understand how one keeps an account," she said, and her voice carried like a bell with the echo of many small, inevitable things. Evelyn, who had practiced navigating social equations all her life, felt suddenly reduced to the simplicity of a debtor on the wrong side of a page. There was a pause between them that was not comfortable, and not quite the thing called peace. In that pause, Evelyn thought of the shard in her pockets and the 2 dots on her collarbone and the laugh she had made on the country lane while a thing lived and then did not. She felt, for the first time, the real weight of an action not fully confessed. "I mean to learn," she said, because learning was the last artful thing she knew how to do when all the dresses had been taken. She did not want to plead. Pleading felt like a performance, and she had done enough of that. "Tell me what this is," she asked the woman. "Tell me what they want." The woman regarded her for a long time. Finally, she shook her head once, and then lit something small and indistinct between her fingers. The smoke rose like old paper. "It is not what they want," she said. "It is what they require." She did not say "they" to point blame at men in suits or strangers. She used the pronoun like currency, a category the world had applied long before Evelyn's vanity gave it weight. "There is a balance older than our excuses. You have been counted against it. You may make your own choice about repayment. Some debts will take you in pieces. Some will take you whole." Evelyn felt the floor of her understanding tilt. She had known, in the way people know the shape of their own shadows, that actions possess a gravity. She had not imagined gravity looking like this. Like small, patient arithmetic done with the bodies of those who had the misfortune to be in orbit of the guilt. "How?" she asked. It was a trivial question, as if the universe could provide a neat instruction manual. The woman smiled without mirth. "People offer themselves," she said. "Sometimes it is the most humane thing left. Sometimes it is the most terrible." Evelyn thought of all the permutations of repentance she had seen in women with daughters, wives with husbands who had left. She thought of the way a woman could give up a career, a name, a portion of herself in an act that appeared to be sacrifice, and was sometimes only transfer. She felt, in the slick of her throat, the idea of offering herself as a strange, terrible mercy. She imagined a life transfigured, not restored, but rearranged so that others might breathe. Later, in the small bitter light of her bedroom, she pressed the shard up to the points on her collarbone and felt a warmth, as if the sliver recognized the skin. The shard hummed marginally. When she placed it on her tongue for a single, reckless moment, she tasted honey first, and then that impossible iron. She thought of him in the rain, and how his kisses had tasted like promises that were also contracts. The next morning came like a letter delivered with no return address. Henry, who had driven her for years and knew the route from her apartment to the opera as a man might know a confession, did not wake up from his nap in the chauffeur's chair behind the wheel of his own car. He had been found with the paper of his newspaper still drooping over his chest. The engine was cold, as if it had never meant to start. There were twin dots on the underside of his jaw, crescent and discreet. Evelyn received the news in a parlor filled with people who were trying to behave as though the calendar could continue. She felt only the small private pricks of responsibility sharpen like needles. She had, in the course of the last week, loved people in increments she had not understood were due. She had let a stranger into the rooms of her life, and, by the accident of attraction, perhaps allowed some account to be drawn against those who depended on her. She had been generous, with appeal, with place settings, with the terrible convenience of being adored. And generosity sometimes accrues in ways that do not respect the distinctions between debt and gift. In the nursery of her thoughts, where she still kept the old ledger of her youth's sins, a single entry burned like a footnote: the country lane, the animal, the flippant stone. She found herself tallying faces she had known, mapping them against the twin marks. She could see no arithmetic that would make sense of it. Only a shape of consequence suggested itself, stubborn and inexorable. She went back that night to the grove where the woman had been. The gum trees loomed like church pillars under a soft rain that smelled of oil and old paper. The woman was there at the same stump, waiting as if their chairs had been arranged in advance. "You cannot undo what was done," she said without preamble. "But you may decide the ledger's terms within certain bounds." "Who are you?" Evelyn asked. She was tired of the small politenesses of her life, of people whose job was only to take her temperature and offer remedies in the form of flowers. The woman did not answer with a name. She only moved her fingers as if spinning invisible thread, and the motion, paradoxically domestic, made the hairs on the back of Evelyn's neck stand up. "I am of a line that keeps accounts," she said finally. "We hold fast to balances. The currency is not cash. It is exchange where life slides like coins beneath a ruler. When something is taken, something is asked." She tapped one knuckle against the log as if knocking on a table. "You may offer substitution. You may offer yourself. You may refuse. Refusal is not mercy. It is only certain." Evelyn understood then the cruel calculus. Even if she could walk away, others would not necessarily be spared. To refuse might mean to allow more to fall. She pictured Claudia asleep in her chaise and Henry behind his wheel. She pictured friends who had sipped champagne at her table and could fall like pages torn from a book. She recognized the small, terrible fact that her giving might change what remained, but would not, perhaps, erase the debt entirely. She asked, finally, what the cost could be. The woman's mouth tightened as if over a difficult accounting. "It will alter you," she said. "It will make the world read you differently. It will give and it will take. It will not be wholesale salvation. It will be a rearrangement. You will be responsible for something the way one is responsible for a house after the roof has been mended, but some tiles remain unfixed." Evelyn found that she could imagine the harm done to others as a ledger that needed balancing. She could imagine offering herself as a shape of mercy, an instrument of a transaction that prioritized the living. Love, in her imagination, had inches of complicity and tenderness. She thought of the man, his touch, the small metallic tang, his cataloging gaze, and felt, with a clarity that frightened her, that her desire had been a transaction all along. She had given him a room in her house. He had left traces. In the arithmetic the world kept, traces might be currency. She left the grove with the shard in her pocket and a new nervousness in her chest. The city felt alterable, like a set with lights that could go down and not come back on. She imagined the ledger as a hearing in a dark room, where decisions were not cruel because they desired cruelty, but because they were inevitable. She spent the night with him in her bed as she had before, but this time it was as if both of them were acting out lines they had not written. When she woke, he was there in the half-light, his face a map she had learned to read for pleasure and now studied for meaning. He looked at her as if with pity, and pity, like attention, can be a kind of theft. "You are thinking of giving," he said quietly. "Or perhaps you already have." "What do you mean?" Evelyn demanded. The phrase came out brittle, the sound of a woman trying to carve herself into a shape that could hold answers. He ran a finger along the twin dots at her collarbone, and then placed his palm over the shard inside her pocket. For a moment the shard vibrated so faintly it was as if a small thing inside the world had decided to awake. His hand was warm and then cold. "The world keeps its own books," he said. "Sometimes it chooses where to make us pay. There is a particular nausea that comes with being noticed for the wrong thing." Evelyn felt it then. The sensation of having been catalogued and judged in some index to which she had not been previously privy. She thought of the woman at the stand of trees, the matriarch, and of the ledger with its patient pages. She thought of the gift she might give and the loss it might entail, and at the center of that thought was the man who seemed to know both price and measure. He became less a lover than an instrument, of either salvation or damnation. She could not be sure which. The night that followed was not the same as those before. There was an intimacy stretched thin by the weight of impending decisions. They spoke in fragments about empty things. The weather, a play she had not seen, a mistake on a menu. At some point, in a movement that was more ritual than impulse, She took the shard from her pocket and set it on the sheets between them. It looked like a small, impossible coin. He watched it with an expression that might have been reverence or paperwork. "If you offer yourself," he said, voice low, "it is not of me that you ask reprieve. You offer to something older." "Then tell me who will be spared," she said. "Tell me who will be safe if I go." His fingers found hers in the dark. "I cannot promise absolution," he said. "But I can say that your choice will move the scales." She did not know if she believed him. Love is often sold as a guarantee we know to be false. She believed, despite herself, that her sacrifice could have weight beyond the private theater of her affection. She understood her own vanity enough to see that it could morph into a new, terrible charity. At the house that winter, the air was thin with consequences. Her choices unfurled not as a single event, but as a series of small, merciless tests. Friends gathered and left. Each presence was an exposure. Evelyn felt like a woman walking in a gallery of her own faults, each portrait a mirror that refused to flatter her. The shard lay like a decision on her dressing table. The man moved between her rooms with the same practiced restraint he had always used. He did not beg her to keep him. He did not ask her to save him. What he asked was silence, and the cost of that silence was more than the usual social consideration. When she offered, finally, to meet whatever the other side demanded, there was a hush, as if the very air understood the calculus of such an act. The man watched her as someone watches a ledger closed, and then opened again. In the last days of that stretch, the pattern of loss crept into sharper focus. A young stylist found in his chair one afternoon with a scalp as smooth as if sleep had been made into a bed. A woman who had been a rival in social games had a nap in a high-powered meeting and did not wake to the round of business. Their deaths were quiet and robbed of melodrama. They performed grief like undertakers used to perform the essential civility of a funeral. Evelyn learned to count not only faces but the positions where the twin dots would manifest. The world was mapping itself with a twin punctuation that read like a signature. She felt, one cold dawn, the presence of the woman again in the trees, and this time she did not come alone. In the blue of early morning the woman stood with another figure beside her, taller, slower in the way of old strength. Their faces were not the faces of the rooms Evelyn frequented. Their language was older, made of small movements that meant more than a conversation. They looked like people who had been keeping a table where life was exchanged in a currency Evelyn had never learned to recognize. 3 days, the taller woman said to Evelyn without preface, as if the phrase had been printed and now read aloud. The mention of days held the gravity of a deadline in a ledger. Deadlines are moral accelerants, and the 3-day rhythm echoed in Evelyn's chest like a clock she'd once ignored. Evelyn's throat closed. The world reconfigured into a small room with a timer. She understood then that waiting would not be passive. There would be choice and movement, and perhaps the last and fiercest demand. She felt the shard like a lodestone in her pocket and the twin dots like a map on her skin. She had given herself already, in the most human way, a kindness, a hospitality, the willingness to be seen. She had not known, in that literal giving, to whom she surrendered herself. The man who had come in from the rain was not merely a man at all, and the line between intention and consequence had thinned until it might be possible to thread the needle of what must be done. The rain began in earnest as she walked back to her car. The gum trees bowed under the showers, as if they were making their own decisions about where water should fall. In her palm, the shard caught the light and responded with a tiny, deliberate glow. She could not say whether it was a warning or an invitation, only that the two had become indistinguishable. As she drove away, the trees watching like audience members at the edge of a stage, Evelyn felt the gravity of things turning toward an unwritable accounting. She had been given a time and a choice. She had seen what the ledger wanted. She had, for the first time, to measure herself against a kind of balance that did not care for regrets expressed in candles. Behind her, in the grove where the matriarch lingered, a bird rose up with the sound of a small bell. The 3 days began to count down the way a clock counts the last moments of a performance. Evelyn drove into a city that was indifferent to moral mathematics, and somewhere in the slow, elegant rooms of her house, the shard hummed a note of expectation, and the man she had given herself to watched from a window and did not blink. The first day of the 3 arrived like a blunt instrument, A morning made only of errands that felt suddenly absurd. Flowers bought with a mechanical tenderness, a letter of condolence typed and left unsigned, a rehearsal of household staff who moved as if they had been told to keep their faces smooth. Evelyn discovered that action was sometimes a way to postpone decision. She kept the shard wrapped in a scrap of silk and pressed it to the inside of her wrist when she feared she would faint. It hummed there the way a kept watch might hum, nothing loud enough to alarm the cook, but loud enough to make her feel accompanied. She arranged visits with those who had been nearest. A lunch with a woman who loved to tell small cruelties as jokes. A short ride to the theater with a man who knew the best seats. Each encounter she treated like a counting exercise, watching for the twin punctures as if they were weather. People looked at her with a softness that was sometimes pity, and sometimes calculation. Evelyn became practiced at offering ordinary kindnesses with the displaced generosity of someone trying to repay an invisible bill. The second day sharpened to edges. The pattern of loss continued, a slow arithmetic. A young assistant at an editor's office took to her desk and did not raise her head again. A neighbor, an old woman who kept her curtains drawn and whose life had been mostly the smell of bread and novels, was found with hands neatly folded, as if she had merely nodded and gone. Each body bore the twin points somewhere, sometimes at the throat, sometimes at the hollow of the wrist, sometimes in the crease behind a knee, like punctuation marking the end of a sentence that had never been properly closed. They brought a last note that afternoon, a card, delicate and anonymous, that read only ledger and a line beneath it. People started to avoid Evelyn at parties in the practical way people avoid a bad wind. They pretended their avoidance was to spare her feelings. Privilege, she learned with a slow, raw clarity, could not buy immunity from the kinds of accounts kept by things older than privilege. That evening she walked to the house of Reverend Martin. The city had gone soft with rain again. Light pooled in curbs and reflected false images of the sky. In the Reverend's sitting room, the smell of orange peels and book glue made a small, grounding thing in her gut. He poured tea with hands that trembled less than hers. For once she did not smooth the conversation into surface charm. She asked questions that felt like confessions. "Is there a way to purchase reprieve?" she asked, and the sentence was honest in a way she had avoided in dozens of salons. He looked down at his cup for a long time. "I've taught people to look inward," he said slowly. "I've counseled them on guilt and resignation. But there are things I know as patterns in my own parish. That hospitality can be dangerous. That leaving doors open invites weather you might not be ready for. I can stand with you in grief. I cannot rewrite what the world's older accounts require." It was both nothing and everything she needed to hear. She told him of the shard in her pocket. He did not remark on it except to suggest caution. He offered a counsel she had expected but resented all the same. Confession is human. It helps the living carry weight. It cannot bargain with the ledger that has other currencies. When she left, Reverend Martin held out his hand, and instead of blessing her said only, "If you must choose, choose with a mind for the living." The phrase was as much instruction as any the world had offered. She carried it like a small coin to be spent later. The third day dawned with the same patient inevitability of a tide. The matriarch had said 3 days like a resignation. Those days had not been a countdown to a spectacle but a narrowing of options. Evelyn spent them measuring who she loved and how those loves might be rearranged by a single act. She called Henry's sister, attended a small private remembrance, and made certain last trivial arrangements that felt like folding the corner of a page in a book so one might return. She slept badly between fits of exhaustion that came like the settling of old dust. At dusk, she returned to the grove. The gum trees in the low light were silhouettes, a congregation for things that had the patience of stone. The matriarch sat as before, with her iron hair threaded back, and a posture that suggested ledger keepers do not need to scrawl hastily. Their hands come already practiced. Beside her stood the taller figure, whose presence had the slow certainty of an old tide. The taller figure was the man who had come to Evelyn in the storm. His coat hair still held a memory of rain, and when he turned his face to her fully in the leaflight, she saw the things she had glimpsed before. A slight, strange iridescence under his skin where a scale might begin. A slow smile that seemed practiced at borders between appetite and calculation. His eyes were quiet, like river water held by night. She found herself following the natural progression of politeness into honesty. I came because I meant to offer myself, she said. Her voice surprised her by how steady it sounded. I cannot bear the thought of more of them falling. The matriarch did not smile. She nodded once. You offer. That is your right. You also have other options if one is inclined to substitution. You may refuse. Refusal has its outcomes. There was no piety in the way she spoke. There was arithmetic. We take because balance must be maintained. We prefer to take those who offer, because it is less brutal in the long counting. But nothing is without consequence. Tell me what it will be, Evelyn said. She found that what she wanted was a map, margins and instructions included. It was a child's wish in an adult's body. The matriarch tapped a knuckle on the log beside her. The sound was like the tick of a clock for someone who has long since abandoned guesswork. It will be alteration, she said. It will be a thing that changes how the world reads you. It will bind you to a ledger of a sort. You will carry a portion of the taking. Will it spare them? Evelyn's question was urgent now, a thing that wanted to be answered with numbers and guarantees. She needed a clear arithmetic she did not get. The matriarch shrugged in a small human gesture. Some will rest easier, she said. Some things shift. Some things, however, will not be allowed to remain. You understand that? Evelyn did. The ritual they proposed was not demonic, not theatrical, and in that there was a peculiar cruelty. It would be intimate and private, and thus merciful in the sense that mercies can sometimes be. It would spare the spectacle while making a trade that would be carried in small, persistent ways. The man would take no blade and no overt violence. The shard would be used because it held a kind of ledger light. It had the narrowness of a coin and could slip under skin like a secret. She could have refused. She thought often in the days before of leaving town, of walking far away and living with the quiet knowledge that she had failed to answer a call. But the thought of friends lying in soft chairs and not rising was a weight that made any flight feel like cowardice. She would not choose cowardice, so she accepted. This was not a romantic surrender. It was an account paid with the self she had cultivated and the body she owned. She dressed in somber, unadorned clothing, no pearls, no white, because the matriarch had said that ceremony had no need for spectacle. They walked together from the grove to Evelyn's house, under a rain that had begun again, softer now, like a cloth being laid gently. The rooms of her house took on the quality of a chapel when they entered. Softened with candlelight. Quiet beyond ordinary domestic clatter. The man moved with the same deliberate restraint, placing chairs where needed, lighting candles, and speaking little. He sat with a hands-on-the-knees composure, and each small motion seemed to be measured against some standard she did not know. The matriarch took the shard from Evelyn's pocket with gloves that were clean but not ceremonial. The sliver lay on Evelyn's palm like a small cold coin. Once placed, the matriarch said, the shard will move as it chooses. You may hum its note by thinking of those you love. You may not call it back. Once the account shifts, it will not return in the same form. Evelyn thought of all the ways to articulate fear and found language too blunt. She thought, instead, of the people who had died and of how her hands had once thrown stones at a small dark creature. She thought of Henry, of Claudia, of a world that kept tally regardless of human intention. Do it, she said. She laid down on her bed because the matriarch had asked it. When she closed her eyes, the house seemed to reel into an echo chamber. The ordinary noises, the refrigerator's small hum, a distant car, fell away. The man sat at the edge of the bed and extended his hand. He placed his palm near her collarbone without pressing. The shard hummed faintly, and when his fingers brushed it, the sound seemed to answer him, as if it recognized his touch. He did not speak of what he was. He did not say he was a ledger or a guardian or a predator. He simply looked at her with the kind of attention that had first drawn her in, an attentive calculation that acknowledged both value and cost. She had loved parts of him, the listening, the small attentions, the way he kept the room tidy of the usual suitor's theatricalities. She also saw him now as something other, a representative, whether willing or not, of a law older than people. The matriarch placed the shard at the twin dots already on Evelyn's collarbone. The contact was cool, and then as if a current had been allowed to move. the points flushed with a color that was not quite red and not quite the cool of bruising. The man leaned forward and whispered something in a language that felt like water slipping under the edge of a stone. Syllables that had weight. Evelyn's chest rose with a sound that might have been a sob or a relief. There was no sharp pain. There was instead a rearrangement, a humming that traveled through bone and nerve like a loom being threaded. Her breath slowed to a careful economy. The shard warmed and then seemed to subside, flattening into the skin as if it had been a foreigner who found a place to rest. The twin dots widened, like punctuation growing into a small script. Evelyn felt, in an immediate and particular way, something move from the room into her body. Something small and patient, like the removal of a coin from a communal shoe. When the matriarch removed her hand, the shard was gone. Where it had been there remained a faint iridescence beneath the skin. Slight enough that a stranger would not notice, but enough that Evelyn could see it when she bent the angle of light. The man pressed his own hand to the place for a long moment, and for once he showed no appetite in his face, only a weary gravity. "There is debt shifted," the matriarch said. "Not all. Not everything that will be required. You will carry a portion, and the world will know you differently. You will be able to move balances in the small way of the living, but not in the wholesale manner of the ledger itself." "What does that mean?" Evelyn asked, because fear had become a practical question. Would she wake the next day? Would more of her friends sleep and not wake? Could she live with an appetite that belonged to something else? The matriarch's eyes held something like pity, but it was pity with the patience of arithmetic. "It means that of the accounts yet unpaid, some may stop tipping toward their own cruel ends. Some things will be stilled. Others will continue. The balance is not one of absolution but of lesser harm. You have chosen to be an instrument. That is both mercy and burden." Evelyn wanted to ask whether this would haunt her. She wanted to ask whether her hands would cause peace or sleep in others. She had the sense that answers would require vocabulary not yet taught to her. She knew only that at the center of that choice she had stopped being merely a woman who entertained the city and become something else. A fulcrum. When she rose from the bed, the room looked unchanged to everyone else. The candles guttered. The kitchen clock ticked. The man stood to the side, and for the first time since she had met him, he seemed solidly inhuman in the way he moved. Too measured, as if each joint had the memory of a long keeping. His skin glinted when the light touched his wrist, a barely perceptible pattern like fine mother of pearl. He bowed his head to the matriarch once, with an efficiency that belonged to a bureaucracy older than human courts. "You have done what you intended," the matriarch said, and there was no ceremony in that observation. "There will be consequences. There will also be peace in certain pockets. Make the small choices wisely." Evelyn left that night with the shard's lingering echo beneath her skin. The next morning the assistant who had collapsed at the editor's desk awoke, blinking as if from a long dream. The neighbor found with folded hands in her chair, however, did not. Some balances had shifted, not all. The city reacted with a mixture of relief and bewilderment. People spoke of waking as if it were a miracle, and of the other deaths as if they were part of the weather. Evelyn felt in the midst of it the strangeness of mercy purchased without absolution. She was, in a literal sense, altered, a fact her mirror showed with a shy and untrustworthy hand. One night, when the light fell right, she saw at the edge of her jaw the faint suggestion of a scale, as if a fish's pattern had been translated into angles upon her skin. It did not frighten her in the clean way fear can. There was a sadness in it, a sense of being marked by an event that had gravity. The man remained. He did not profess love in the way novels promised. He did not say he would stay. He did not need to. There were intimate gestures he offered, a hand across the small of her back, a quiet attention when the city became too loud. He was both companion and instrument, someone whose presence stabilized the ritual of her new position. When lovers asked her about him, Evelyn said in half-truths that he was a man who had arrived when she needed a quiet. The half-truth tasted sour to her own mouth. She learned, slowly, how the world read her differently. At a luncheon a few weeks later, a hostess reached, by reflex, and smoothed her hair with new tenderness that was less flirting than protective. When Evelyn touched a friend's forearm in passing, that friend's breath would sometimes deepen and sleep near to settling. Other friends merely felt a quieting, like someone easing a child into a chair. It was inconsistent. The ledger did not promise neat equations. She began to test small edges with the care of someone learning how a new instrument responded. Once she found that a soft, sincere apology, if given before touch, altered the result. It dulled the sleep. It calmed the dread. Once she touched without thought, and a neighbor in an adjacent room slept for a long afternoon, as if some distant bell had been rung. The matriarch visited again, but not like a judge making a pronouncement. She arrived like a representative who wanted to make sure a new device was functioning. She observed Evelyn in rooms, watched the reactions of those around her with a practiced eye, and noted things down with nothing more than a small nod. "You have not paid all," she said once in Evelyn's sitting room. It was not accusation. It was an observation that had the tone of an accountant reconciling a book. "There will be more accounts. Your portion will be called upon in ways you have not yet anticipated. That is how the ledger keeps pace." "Will I be lonely?" Evelyn asked, because the possibility of being a living instrument worried a fundamental human fear. To be used in the name of saving others was noble at a distance. It could be isolating in the same breath. "Loneliness is a human tally," the matriarch observed. "We keep other company." The woman produced then an odd offering. A small folded ledger of paper. Nothing like the world in which Evelyn kept her receipts. Instead, a tiny book with ruled pages and a cover of gray cloth. "Keep this. Not as a promise, but as a practice. Write what you find. Note the edges. It will help you of the long hours." Evelyn did. She scribbled, in the small spare hours, entries that read like an account. Occasions where touch stilled a breath, where apology altered a fate, where she pressed a hand over a friend's chest and found the heartbeat slower and quieter, but not departed. Her handwriting grew small, economical. The ledger was not holy. It was a practical instrument, an index for someone learning to live inside an altered skin. The months that followed had the rhythm of an altered life. She went to the theaters and the parties, but with new restraint. Pleasures tasted different when the consequence of an absent thought might mean another's fall. She moved through her social round with caution, practicing gestures and apologies. Her friends who remained near her were gently altered too. A certain softness to their laughter, a new impatience with spectacle. People who had once envied her called more often to ask for quiet kindnesses. She obliged when she could, sparing them from the ledger's appetite. Love, where it existed for her, became lined with complicity and reparation. She loved the man in fits and starts, for the listening he provided, for the practical steadiness of his hands in small things. She resented him, too, in the private hours, for being both the instrument of her salvation and the vector of her guilt. She could not say whether he had been the one to bring the shard into her life, or whether he was merely a figure in an old accounting. It mattered less than the truth that the ledger had found a way to speak through the world. There were moments of tenderness. Once, late in a summer when Jasmine filled the conservatory, the two of them sat and listened to the rain against the glass. He took her hand, and there was no calculation in the way he held it. Only the small sincerity of a person who, perhaps, had capacities beyond human reckoning. "You changed things," he said softly. "You rebalanced where you could. You performed mercy where mercy could be given." "Was it mercy?" she asked. He did not answer directly. He only pressed the pad of his thumb to the faint iridescence at her collarbone. "It was action," he said. "Merit is not mine to assign." She sometimes thought that the ledger's rules had been designed to test an odd combination. Whether vanity could turn into penitence. She thought of her younger self, who had flung stones at a roadside creature, because the act had fit a brief rush. She thought that if she had been kinder then, perhaps the ledger would have left her alone. But memory is a difficult currency with many deflective accounts. The matriarch had told the truth when she called it a balance older than apologies. Not all things settled in patterns of small mercy. Once, when Evelyn attended the funeral of a distant acquaintance who had been unwell for some time, she found the man standing at the edge of the service like an archivist. He watched the pallbearers and the folding of cloth, and when she returned home, he told her simply, "There will be demands that cannot be mediated by a single life. You have reduced the toll in corners, but the ledger will always be hungry enough to remind us that nothing unbalanced stays so." She pressed back, the human need to barter with the unknowable. "Could you leave?" she asked once late on a winter night. "Would it change anything if you were not here?" He shook his head. "We are not singular in a world that keeps books," he said. "Often my presence has the effect of allowing the ledger to choose differently. Absence is sometimes the loudest call. You cannot, by evicting me, expect debts to cancel." There were episodes that Elizabeth the Socialite had never prepared for in her manuals of charm. Moments when a casual touch produced a hush. Times when she laid a hand on a small child's forehead, and the child slept beneath her palm for a long while, waking refreshed. Times when a neighbor took a long, unaccountable illness after she had spoken with careless impatience. The ledger's arithmetic was uneven. Her life felt like walking on glass that sometimes carried weight, and sometimes did not. She sought Reverend Martin again on a late afternoon when the world outside seemed to hold its breath. He received her with the same small courtesy as always. He had, perhaps, grown to expect impossible confessions from her. "I have become an instrument," she told him. "We keep other company now. I do not know if that is a blessing." He listened and then clasped his hands like someone who might be willing to be practical. "You cannot be everything," he said. "You are not meant to be. Nor are you meant to be nothing. Tell me what you fear most." "That I will become the world that took from me," she said. "That I will forget how to live. That I will lose my small human edges and become only function." He regarded her with the tenderness of a man who had watched people navigate private tragedies. "Function without feeling is a form of exile," he said. "Do not let the ledger make you inhuman. Keep friends who will remind you of your name in ordinary ways. Keep small, ridiculous habits that anchor you in the human world." She promised she would. She tried to keep promises. She kept a small porcelain bird on her dressing table, a silly thing given at a harvest from a friend, because the bird had the surprising power to ground her. Its ridiculousness reminded her of small domesticities. She learned to laugh about trivial things at dinner parties, and to apologize with sincerity when she was sharp-tongued. In those ways, she tried to be an instrument that could still love. The matriarch's visits became less frequent and more administrative. She dropped by with observations rather than commands. "You are learning the edges," she would say, as if making a note in her own mind. "Remember that the ledger's appetites include not only bodies, but also certainties. People who let their minds harden into doctrine become as dangerous as those who refuse to account at all." The man, whose presence had begun as enigma, offered her occasionally stories of a lineage not narrated in human histories. He spoke in fragments of rules and of preservation. He did not claim responsibility for every nuance of the ledger, only to have been part of the emergent system that kept balance. Sometimes Evelyn imagined him as both bank and bankrupted, a creature whose own existence was caught in that same old arithmetic. One day a letter arrived, not anonymous this time, but a fragile card in the handwriting of Claudia's sister. She thanked Evelyn for having handled things with quiet and praised a life she had admired. The letter was a kind of currency of grief. Both consolation and accusation rolled into one. Evelyn cried over it, as she was accustomed to cry for the trivial spectacle of loneliness, and now for something deeper. The sense that even acts of generosity can have hidden ledgers. As the years drew on, the immediate crisis passed into a slow condition. The pattern of people slipping into final sleep became rarer, but never wholly stopped. Evelyn had, through action, altered some trajectories. She had, through her surrender, become an instrument the ledger could use to move balances in small ways. She learned limits. She learned, painfully, that some suffering could not be undone by a single sacrifice. Her reflection in the mirror remained unreliable. On certain mornings, when the light caught her at a particular angle, there would be a shimmer along her clavicle like mother of pearl, faint as if a shell's edge had been pressed just beneath the skin. The twin dots had not vanished. They had been transformed into a quiet flourish that sometimes glowed in lamplight and sometimes remained invisible to others. They were, for her, a reminder and a burden. She sometimes touched them in public and felt a small familiar ache, the price of dossiers kept in bodies. The man stayed. The matriarch stayed on her terms. The ledger continued to be a thing with patience. Evelyn practiced living in a net she had accepted. Sometimes it gave, sometimes it withheld. In private, however, there were changes that unsettled her most. Her appetite, once purely social, now carried a new edge. When she kissed, she tasted honey still, but the iron tang was steadier. It was as if the world's counting had left a mineral under her tongue. She sometimes found herself understanding decisions of balance in ways that made her stomach lurch. A kindness could be a payment. A favor could be a ledger entry. The social life she had once worn like a costume now felt like a place where small moral choices roamed. When friends lost their tempers and cried in her sitting room, she would offer soothing phrases and find that her touch could ease panic. In a small theater where an actress fainted from a fever, Evelyn cradled her head and felt the woman's breath change under her palm. The actress woke with a start and later told Evelyn, bewildered, that she had a dream of a ledger and a woman who pressed a hand on her chest and whispered apologies. The actress wept and sent Evelyn a note of thanks. The letters multiplied in small human ways: gratitude, relief, bewilderment. Yet the ledger had not been wholly satisfied. Once, months after the shard had been placed into her skin, a distant friend, someone who had attended many of her parties in a peripheral way, collapsed at a luncheon and did not wake. The tiny double points were found at the base of her throat. The lady's family asked awkward questions about the life of the affluent and whether there had been any secret. Evelyn attended the funeral and felt the old guilt like a shadow on a clear day. It returned with a stubborn force. She had altered some tides, but not all. The ledger remained patient. When the mother returned again, older perhaps wound tighter into her duties, the conversation was practical. "You kept your promise," she said simply. "You took a share, and in taking it you may have saved others. But remember, the ledger evolves. It adapts. It remembers those who have postponed its appetite. It will find angles." Evelyn looked at her and felt the small human desire to bargain vanish. "Is there no way to close the books?" she asked. It was less a plea than a plan, the sort in which one hopes for pragmatics. "There are no absolutes," the matriarch said. "There are only accounts rebalanced. Some are made lighter. Others remain. This is not a world where ledgers are emptied with a single sacrifice." The man who had first courted her with his quiet attentions remained an ambivalent presence. There were times he would stand by the window and appear older than she, as if his life measured decades in a way she could not. There were times he would laugh with a small, almost human sound at a joke she thought amusing. On stormy nights he would smooth her hair and bring her a hot cup of tea, the smallest domesticities that made her remember the pleasures of ordinary affection. She loved him in fits, loves that were sometimes tender, sometimes deeply vexed. She loved him for the listening and for the way he had allowed her to be a kind of agent in a cruel world. She resented him because his belonging to a ledger had given him some authority she had not earned. In the end, the change in her life had two tracks: the public and the private. Publicly, she continued as a woman of means, a hostess who could still cause a room to rearrange itself by a glance. Privately, she was an archivist of a different kind, someone who kept the ledger's patterns written in a small book on her dressing table. She was more careful with gifts and more exacting with apologies. She counted the names she touched and the way their hearts seemed to slow or settle. She saw the man as both partner and function. The most intimate part of her afterlife, if one could call it that, was the knowledge that she had given herself in something that did not look like surrender in the old, melodramatic sense, but like careful payment. She had chosen to be an instrument not to remove consequence, but to sculpt it. She had chosen, in the way mortal people sometimes choose mercy, to accept an altered fate, rather than watch others slip. That choice would echo in ways she could not measure. There were days when she regretted what she had given, and nights when she thanked herself for the same decision. Love had become entangled with obligation. Saving someone was never free. The man remained present and perturbing and sometimes tender, and the matriarch's ledger continued to breathe across the world like an old machine whose purpose was not malice, but maintenance. On an ordinary afternoon, a year after the shard had touched her skin, Evelyn stood at her dressing table and looked at herself. The room smelled faintly of jasmine. She caught sight of the twin dots in the mirror. They glowed under the light like small punctuation. When she leaned forward, she noticed where the light hit them. There was for a moment an image, a reflection that split as if the glass had been a surface between two rooms. In one room she saw herself as she had been, elegant and youthful, oblivious and uninterrupted. In the other she saw herself as she had become, marked, careful, carrying an accounting. The two images did not merge. She touched the small, iridescent flourish at her collarbone, and the sensation was familiar now. A small, metallic coolness, a faint hum like a clock whose sound had been lived with for a long time. She thought of the creature at the country lane and of the stone, and she felt a sorrow that had the simple geometry of a closed sum. She had repaid, in part, for a violence done with juvenile hands and a certain thoughtless laughter. Nothing could undo the beginning, but she had chosen to answer. The man entered without announcement and stood behind her, putting his hands on her shoulders in a gesture that was much less transaction than once she thought. "You did what you could," he said. His voice was careful. "You have kept others from a certain end. That is not small." She turned to him, and for a long moment the two of them stood at the small center of her life, like two people who had built a house together from different materials. "Will it be enough?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that might have been tenderness or accountability. "Enough changes shape," he said. "What is enough for a ledger is not the same as what is enough for a heart. You must be content to learn the difference." She found she could be content with such limitations. Perhaps content is the wrong word. Steadiness might be better. She would not be absolved of mistake, but she could live with her choices. The ledger had taken a portion. She had gained the ability to shift small tides in favor of life. The world remained complicated and morally reticent. Years later, when the city had folded other winters into its maps, and when the names of those who had fallen had become, for some, a story to tell about an unfortunate season, Evelyn still kept the little ledger the matriarch had given her. She wrote entries in it sometimes, not as a penitent, but as one who wanted to keep a record of what actions did. The lines became a map of the daily ethics one might need when living with a capacity that could alter others. Sometimes, late at night, she would go out into the grove. The gum trees would creak, and the matriarch would sometimes be there, older but steady. They would stand together and listen to the small night noises, the passing of a tram, the distant laughter of people who had yet to know what balance demanded. The matriarch would nod once, and then withdraw. She would not offer much counsel, only the kind of company reserved for those who have been through the books together. There were still deaths. There were still sudden endings. A distant acquaintance who telephoned to say they'd had a collapse at luncheon. A cousin who took ill and went quietly. The world was not made safe by Evelyn's offering. It was merely altered at its edges, such that sometimes the ledger chose a different path. The mathematics of mercy had changed only in local minima. Evelyn aged with the patience of someone who had been taught new arithmetic. The twin dots at her collarbone remained, faint and iridescent. When she kissed, the honey and the iron were still present, a reminder that sweetness and cost lived together. She loved the man in the practical way of two people who knew a history of choices. He sometimes left for periods and sometimes stayed for years. He aged differently and yet was always, to her, on the border between human and other. On the 15th anniversary of the night she had first found the shard, she walked into the conservatory where jasmine hung heavy. The light was a strange gold, the kind that honors memory. She set her palm over the small flourish on her collarbone and remembered the 3 days as if they were another life. She thought of the children of friends, of a city that had become less careless in some private corners, and of the ledger that had a way of insisting on its accounts. The man came to her then and took her hand. They sat and watched a small bird that had become domesticated find crumbs on the sill. When he leaned close, she smelled rain and a trace of salt, and for a moment the calculation slipped away, and she was simply a woman with a hand in another's. "What would you have done if you'd been asked later to offer more?" she asked, because even the quaintness of the conservatory could not dispel the larger question. He considered. "I do not know," he said finally. "I can tell you only this, that what you offered shifted things. There will be more ledgers and more pages. Some choices you will be asked to make you will not. That is how balance reasserts itself. All one can do is try to choose with respect for life." Evelyn closed her eyes and felt the hum under her skin like the memory of a bell. "Then I will try," she said. "I will try to be careful." She did. She tried. When she died, years later, she did so in a manner that the papers could render elegant. A soft evening, a small gathering, roses placed on a casket. People would later write about her as an emblem of a certain class who had known misfortune and handled her affairs with dignity. Some friends would remember the kindnesses she had performed in her subtle way, calls to those lonely, quiet visits, dinners where she made room at a table for people who had been overlooked. But in bedrooms and in small private notebooks, there were other notes. The man and the matriarch and Reverend Martin, older now and kinder in some ways, kept accounts. In the exacting ledger the matriarch had given her, there was, in the last pages, an entry small as a coin that read like a private epitaph. Offered self. Balance altered. Small mercy achieved. Consequences remain. People would talk of Evelyn's life as elegantly spent. Some would say she had been too reckless. Others that she had been brave. Those who had been touched by her hand. The neighbor who had been eased through a long afternoon of sleep by her touch. The actress who had woken from a swoon, would tell stories of a woman whose fingers brought peace. The man remained in the city longer, and when he left at last, there was no parade. He put his hand on the small of Evelyn's grave, and walked away like someone who had closed a book. The matriarch returned to the grove, and the gum trees swayed as if noting the movement of accounts kept and closed. The ledger, however, kept its work. The pages were patient. Debts would always come due in one way or another. The world had patterns older than houses and parties, and it would continue to keep them. Evelyn had altered a small segment of that arc. She had not solved anything. She had paid, and thereby changed the vector of certain consequences. The moral arithmetic of the place tightened and loosened around the people who lived there. In the years after, certain guests at Evelyn's old soirees would sometimes whisper, eyes lowered. "She gave herself," they would say, and the sentence would be offered like a story with a moral, though the moral itself had learned to refuse simple language. Was she saint or sinner, merchant or martyr, lover or ledger? The question became the sort of thing people ask to make meaning from an uncomfortable world. Late one afternoon, long after her breath had stopped and after the city had added new towers that rebelliously caught light, a young woman lay in the bed of Evelyn's old house, pressing a pale hand to the place on her collarbone where the old socialite had once kept her small, shining secret. The little flourish there no longer glowed as it had the first years. It had settled like a coin set into a finger. Outside, the gum tree rustled in a wind that carried no judgment, only the noise of leaves. The man, older and perhaps a little less inscrutable, paused at the window and watched the branches move. There was, in the rustling, the sound of pages turning. If this ending left you haunted, tell me what you would choose if faced with such a ledger. Share this with someone who likes slow-burn tales. Perhaps they will sit with you in the uneasy quiet.